About 4 years ago, I tried to do low carb and then even keto for a couple of months, then a couple of years, and I now want to draw a few quick conclusions. First of all, if I do then eat carbs, either again or just normally, then it seems to be the case that my cardiovascular performance seems to be a little bit higher. I do have just an additional edge, especially also if I did eat carbohydrates before training. Now this edge might sometimes be prevented to some extent by lacking hydration, because at least in my experience, if I eat especially lots of carbs, then they also seem to draw water. And if I then am not properly hydrated, or I drink not the according amounts of water, which sometimes then mean if I normally ate, that I would have too much of basically a stomach or a filled digestive tract to properly execute the workout, then this seems to negatively impact my training. So the hydration needs to be also provided in order for this effect to kick in. Now, this is now on the cardiovascular side. In terms of strength training, the same effect seems to be there to some extent. If I am on carbohydrates, or I have higher carbohydrates, especially also somewhat refined carbohydrates, and not so much carbohydrates from vegetables, for example, because carbohydrates from vegetables need to be properly digested, which means usually if I do squats, for example, and I have a stomach that is filled with carbohydrates that is mostly from vegetables, then my stomach is just too filled in order to have proper form with squats, for example. And the same is true also for running and so on and so forth, because there seems to be an upper limit of volume of the digestive tract that I can handle somewhat well and then still perform maybe an hour after I ate or 2 hours after I ate. Otherwise, I cannot use the carbs, because then the carbs go basically into my bloodstream and then they are unused, and they might even be stored as fat if I didn't need them specifically. So there seems to be kind of a very tight, not feedback loop, but a very tight order of steps which I have to follow. Otherwise, this seems to then negatively impact my training. Now, this is cardiovascular side and also the strength training. Now, there seems to be some evidence, or at least I recently saw a video by Thomas DeLauer where he summarized the non-fasted or fat versus fasted state in terms of training, in terms of cardiovascular, but also in terms of resistance training as follows. The adaptation that one gets from the training seems to be greater in a fasted state, but in a non-fasted state, you seem to be able to peak a little bit better, or have a little bit of a higher performance, which means in a gym, for example, taking a little bit more weight, or with a given set amount and a given rep amount, you might not. A given set amount or given weight, you might be able to do more reps. Now, in terms of cardiovascular, you might be able to run a little bit faster, and this seems to be also somewhat true, at least for me. Not only somewhat true, but I actually hit. So I did start OMAD and also then switching into the low carb and ketogenic diet in early 2020. And so I was on OMAD for almost an entire month, with one exception, and then I did not do 23-1, so 23 hours of fasting and only 1 hour of eating. That's rigged, because I just couldn't hold it up any longer. I still tried to, but I couldn't. So what I then noticed is that, so there were a couple of times where I then went really back on carbs, mostly because my body craved carbs so much, not because it was an intentional decision. And so on these days, where I probably also overate, so my body had more energy to expense anyway, and there seems to be an effect that if I have too much energy, so my body wants to get rid of energy, then it seems to basically, if I have a given amount of willpower at a certain time of the day, which also probably is, in terms of a feedback loop, connected to my body's ability to perform, because I think of myself as an agent that sits in my brain and is somewhat simulated by my brain, because my body can shut me off at any point in time, which is usually referred to as sleep, or knocking someone unconscious is also something that is not knocking someone unconscious, but could be potentially unconscious. Now, I do want to not make this video too long. Therefore, I included now 3 different points which I still want to make. And the first one is sense of urgency. The longer I am on fasting, but also on keto, the more my sense of urgency seems to increase. Now, my sense of urgency seems to increase even up to the point where it is then not useful any longer. Now, up to a certain point, sense of urgency can be great. I need to do this thing really right now, but then there comes a point where it is just too much, at least for me, and this also comes along usually with body temperature. So now, it's basically, I am trying now to make whatever I'm trying to do work. And if my body temperature then also is decreased, and also I might already be hungry because I'm fasting or I'm on the ketogenic diet but crave carbs, then my body temperature usually is lower. This also has been, at least to some extent, measured by my smartwatch, by my Garmin Phoenix, which in the older version, so the 6S Pro, measured only the temperature of the device, I think, but now it actually has been mentioned, at least in some posts, that this was also skin temperature. Now, I'm not exactly sure what it is right now, and whether it actually now measures skin temperature. What seems to be the case, at least measured on the 6S Pro, is that the temperature of the device seems to be with otherwise somewhat constant constraints. Now, maybe it would be better to describe it like this. If I were to watch in a room and the room is not ventilated, or of course I heat the room maybe up over time, or the room might cool down over time, but let's just assume this is kind of standard or doesn't change that much, then as I eat, usually my body temperature rises. This might be up to 30 degrees or 31 degrees. Not necessarily my body temperature, but just the temperature the device showed me. Up to 31 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius, sometimes even. In summer, it might even be 33 degrees Celsius. And if I then fast for a long period of time, this also might be in summer, then my body temperature seems to go to 30 degrees to 29, sometimes even to 28. Now, the closer I am to the lower range, the better I'm able to usually also sleep, but only up to the point where I'm not kind of urgently freezing, alert, and so on and so forth. So then I might lie awake in bed and think about all the things I need to do, but not be able to sleep, which would be the thing I need to do right now. The third would be fasting. Now, I've also kind of introduced the ketogenic or low carb diet into my life, mostly because I wanted to make the 1 meal or 2 meal a day eventually, and now I'm back to basically eating just normally with 3 meals usually, sometimes even more than this. I wanted to make this easier. In the beginning, it was somewhat easy with the 23-to-1, but this didn't really work in the long term. It was also not socially that compatible. So I also basically, I think in the long term, was not able to get enough nutrients in. I'm basically overloading my system at one point during the day, which was the dinner, and then I think if you just think about protein, and many people recommend having multiple protein feedings throughout the day, then this probably was not sufficiently provided by a meal that I could eat in one sitting. And also it has to be then somewhat nutrient dense, because your stomach also shrinks over 23 hours. Not necessarily 23, but let's say you eat and then your stomach size increases, and then as basically the food leaves into the digestive tract, it might shrink again. But you also might need to drink water depending on how much carbohydrates you ate, which then also draw additional water. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a point in time at which the stomach begins to shrink, and then it is kind of at the minimal point, at the lowest point of volume, shortly before you eat, and it might even be not at this point in time, at this point if you drink a lot. So you can also expand the stomach with drinking a lot, I think at least. But what I'm trying to say is that it became very hard, or it probably becomes very hard after a certain point in time, to just get the nutrients in, especially the right nutrients. And also it seemed to just not work that well with my body. Even though the sense of urgency is then increased for the rest of the day, I usually could work a little bit better the longer I fasted, but only up to the point where my body temperature, which seems to be one of the main markers actually, not so much hunger, because hunger seems to peak after a couple of hours, depending on whether sleep was in between there, which sleep seems to usually decrease hunger, at least for myself. So the body temperature and my how I perceive basically the temperature seems to be one of the main indicators of my body's metabolic state. And as my body temperature then decreases during a longer fast, but also on the ketogenic diet or also on the low carb diet, I also have to admit that I never really probably hit the threshold of 50 grams of carbs, or went below the threshold of 50 grams of carbs per day, which is already one of the higher thresholds. There are some people that recommend only 25 grams. There is also the concept of net carbs, because some carbs such as sugar, not sugary, but alcohols, for example, there seem to be a certain type of alcohol that there are counted as carbs, but that do not impact your blood sugar so much. So you could also think maybe of net carbs, but then also activity levels and also your physical size and also your muscle glycogen store size seem to be factors which might impact this. And so over the last years, what I've landed on mostly right now is that I do eat carbs. I try to avoid carbs still a little bit. I also have to mention, maybe I try to avoid basically all fruit, because if I have fructose in my diet, what I notice is, and this seems to also be based on some evidence, that fructose seems to basically dysregulate the two hunger hormones, which would be leptin and ghrelin. So the one is for satiety, the other one is for hunger, and it seems to dysregulate them. Now, some own thinking on this might be that if a bear, for example, sees a big field of raspberries, then it might make sense to eat all of those, because, I mean, think about an animal that only comes to a location at one point, or an animal that is wandering, for example. Or it might also be the case that on the next day another bear already, or some other animal, might already have eaten all the raspberries. So basically what I'm trying to say, every occasion to eat something that is very energy dense might be a very unique occasion. So it might sense to some extent to dysregulate basically the appetite in a way that it would upregulate hunger. Now, I've noticed again and again, if I have any fructose in my diet, then this seems to basically give me the ability to infinitely eat, and this is usually not very useful in the long term, especially since then I probably am lacking in protein, because my stomach is then filled with things that are not protein rich, and then I probably become protein deficient, in addition to probably being too high on the sugar, and then my body can't handle it very well. So trying to avoid fructose seems to be very useful. I also try to avoid glucose, not glucose, but glucose, for now a couple of years already. I went off glucose for multiple months to years, at points even, but I still had fruit at this point in time, and I also still had honey. So basically not sugar, but very sweet alternatives, you could say. Also there are a couple of other alternatives. I also still had sweeteners. Now, I already knew this for, I think, a couple of months to years, but I also should have tried to avoid sweeteners. I had stevia, for example, for some extent in my diet, or for some period in my diet. I also had a few other things in my diet that were, so for example, there is also xylitol, there is erythrit, if these are the right proper English translations, I don't know. What I've noticed is that a given level, and this is now not so much about the carbs, but also it also is not mostly, but it also influences the carb thing to a certain extent. So if my body's need is here for nutrients, and my body signals me the ideal food, let's just assume there's the ideal food I can eat right now, and signals me to eat the ideal food right now with this level of hunger, then if I eat the ideal food, then my hunger decreases. But if I now have the availability of more nutrient-dense foods, then I can additionally eat. And it depends, of course, how much I can additionally eat, but it seems to be similar to the bear that now has this unique situation where he can eat a lot of calories, which he might need for winter, because in winter he does winter sleep. I think that's the proper word. Maybe there's another word. Now, it seems to make sense for the bear, and maybe also for me, with me being somewhat similar to a bear, maybe, to eat more food, even though my body's needs are already kind of fulfilled. But if I have a bar of chocolate in front of me, if I have 10 apples in front of me, if I have pancakes with apples in front of me, then I might, at a given level of hunger, basically would be able to eat more at a higher level of otherwise hunger. But I don't have this higher level of hunger. It is just that I can eat more at any point in time with any given level of hunger. I just could eat maybe 10%, maybe 20%, maybe 30% more given these other foods. So what I'm trying to say is that these other foods basically increase how much I can eat at a given level of actual body need of nutrients. And so basically getting rid of or food selecting, basically getting rid of foods like this, getting rid of, in my case, lots of fruit, basically all of fruit. Also getting rid of sweetness, because sweetness seems to have the same effect. Because the body then seems to think that this is actually sweet, so therefore it is nutrient dense or more nutrient dense because there's glucose in there and not so much 10 kilograms of broccoli, which might be not as nutrient dense as a little bit of sugar with fat, for example, also. Then I basically decrease the amount of calories my body needs actually, or my body is able to eat, or my body wants me to eat, kind of. And I basically reduce it to maybe the actual body's need, which then would be closer to what leads to ideal body composition, which I still try to approximate, but haven't been able to re-establish up from where I basically made a few mistakes, a few nutritional mistakes. One could describe it like this. And this is also the reason why I avoided fructose, and also basically I avoid, as of now, all sweeteners. Also, I had protein powders which were only available sweetened, and I also tried meal shakes, for example, which in the beginning I ordered sweetened because what could happen, but I already knew that this would be happening, that this effect was already there, and I just decided to ignore it because, well, if I can have fuel, for example, which is one meal shake with cookies and cream, then I can have cookies and cream every day, which is to some extent, I think retrospectively at least a ridiculous thought, because I then am not able to actually kind of work together with my hunger. My hunger is here, and then I'm asking my body, okay, do you now want cottage cheese or curd? And if I want cottage cheese, then probably my body wants more fat. If I want more curd, then my body probably wants more protein, and so on and so forth. So these, if you have two food choices and your body usually prefers one, at least in my case, then it seems to be the case. Sometimes I also don't really know what my body actually wants, but I'm still hungry, and then I just try a few different things, which seems to be ridiculous, because why would this then be the case? But is my body confused? I don't know. But then if you have two food choices and your body or my hunger usually steers me, I think is the proper word, towards one. And this is then what I try to do. But this only works, this whole mechanism only works if I get rid of all of the things that negatively impact this communication between my hunger and my body and the other part of my brain that is not me with me. And so that's kind of I already now had these different points now. In terms of work, it seems to be the lower carb I go, the more alert I seem to be on average. If I take a week, for example, and then I have multiple feedings of carbohydrates, then I probably am not getting that much done during that week. What might be the case is that my workouts might peak a little bit more in terms of their intensity, but what also might be the case that because I have higher body temperature, now this also might be a different effect. If I eat more, just in general, then my body temperature is probably higher. My body temperature also seems to increase when I eat a lot of protein, but I don't know if it is just because of the additional carbohydrates. This also seems to be the case with fat, I think. With maybe some, so protein seems to have a better metabolic effect of increasing basically your body temperature or your core temperature or some of temperature. Now, there might be kind of a sauna effect happening. So basically, if I work out normally and I'm fasted, then I'm somewhat cool. But if I now already have eaten before, then my body, first of all, has the additional stressor, which is the food digestion. So I might also have decreased mental availability. Now, if I then work out and my body already is somewhat heated up to 1, 2, or 3 degrees, then I basically have a little bit of a heat exposure. Not heat exposure, but rather warmth exposure compared to the baseline where I would be cooler running because my body is not digesting food, so therefore not trying to give off excess energy, for example. But also, I do have basically more resources available in terms of mental resources, but also in terms of the body's resources. But there might be the negative side effect of this, of basically not being fed. So in a fasted state is that, or might be that you might not have enough nutrients in order, so you might not have a totally filled up glycogen store, and therefore you cannot squat as much, for example. This might be the other side of the coin or of the medal. Now, if you then already have a certain stress also on your cardiovascular system, because what I often notice is that if I eat a little bit more, then my heart rate also seems to go up really up to the point where I then notice basically every single beat, because I can feel these beats whenever at least they are heated up, not heated up, but have increased. When the pulse is increased, I then notice, because I can hear them usually. I also often also wear earplugs, which seems to also increase the effect, or at least the threshold up from which I then can hear the heartbeats. And so you might have a little bit more of a cardiovascular workout with everything you do, because your body temperature is increased, or I don't know specifically what the effect would be, but that's kind of an overall conclusion of trying to avoid carbohydrates with low carb and keto. So basically still try to avoid very refined carbohydrates, and also try to avoid glucose and fructose and basically anything with added sugar, and have actually recently added flour back into my diet in terms of pancakes, which seems to, at least if I am somewhat very cautious with this, seems to somewhat positively affect my ability to perform throughout the week, but only if I don't basically just eat the food because I need a pause, or I don't know specifically what all of the different mechanisms would be where I would reach out such a food. Maybe also because I'm dopamine deficient, or at least I feel I am, and cannot hold it any longer with less dopamine, or I have a sense of urgency that increased too much, and then if I eat a few carbs, it basically goes back down a little bit.